I still remember the night I first met Rachel, July 12, 2014. It was one of those muggy summer evenings in Boston where the air felt heavy with humidity and the streets buzzed with that mix of Friday night energy and distant sirens. I was 24, fresh out of college, working my first real job as a junior systems analyst at a mid-sized tech firm. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment near Somerville, had a second-hand Toyota, and spent most of my weekends either coding personal projects or watching Netflix with cheap beer. Life was ordinary, but stable. Rachel wasn't ordinary. She had that kind of confidence that filled a room before she even spoke. A sharp laugh, manicured nails, and an energy that made you feel like if you were near her, you were missing out on something bigger. She worked as a marketing assistant back then, though she talked like she was destined for LA or New York, like Boston was just a temporary holding station for her ambitions. When we started dating, it was fast, intense, almost cinematic. Dinners at places I'd never been able to afford before, little spontaneous road trips to New Hampshire just because she wanted to breathe new air. At first, I liked that about her. She made me want to be better, dress better, talk smarter, dream bigger. I was a simple guy from Worcester. She was fire and drive and style. But beneath that whirlwind, there were things I didn't notice, or maybe things I didn't want to. Like how she always seemed a little dissatisfied. The apartment was too small. My car wasn't comfortable. The places I liked to eat were quaint in that half-complimentary, half-condescending tone. She'd scroll through Instagram for hours, comparing herself to influencers who seemed to live inside perfect sunlight. She'd sigh and say things like, "We'll get there someday, right?" I'd always nod. I wanted her to believe I could get us there. Over time, her words became a sort of fuel. I started picking up freelance work after my 9 to 5, taking on extra projects for local businesses, building websites for side cash. I didn't complain. I convinced myself it was love, doing whatever it took to make her happy. And maybe it was love at first. Maybe I genuinely wanted to give her the world she dreamed of. But somewhere around 2016, it stopped being about her happiness and started becoming about proving something. Not to her, not to anyone else, just to myself. That was the year I got promoted. My first real jump, project manager. My salary doubled. I remember showing her my offer letter, expecting excitement. Instead, she asked, "So, does that mean we can finally move into a place with a view?" I laughed it off, but that question stuck. She didn't care about what I'd achieved, only what it could buy. By then, I'd started noticing her spending habits more. The designer bags that appeared on sale. The monthly hair appointments that cost more than my car insurance. The way she'd leave online shopping tabs open on my laptop, as if to remind me that success came with certain expectations. Still, I loved her, or at least the version of her I thought she could be if she stopped needing so much. Our weekends became quieter, though not in the peaceful way. She'd be on her phone, I'd be on my laptop, and the silence between us felt like an echo chamber of everything we weren't saying. My parents noticed it. My best friend, Kyle, noticed it too. He once told me, half joking, that Rachel was the kind of woman who marries a millionaire, not builds one. I brushed it off as jealousy, but deep down, it stung because he wasn't entirely wrong. Then 2017 hit, and with it came a shift. My company offered me the chance to lead a high-profile client project. It meant long hours, late nights, and weekends at the office, but also a huge bonus and a career jump. Rachel wasn't happy about it. She said I was married to work. I told her it was for our future. She said, "What future if we never spend time together?" We fought, we made up, and the cycle repeated. I kept pushing myself harder, thinking if I could just reach that next level, maybe she'd see me differently. Maybe she'd stop comparing us to others. But every time I brought something new, better furniture, a trip to Miami, a new car, her excitement faded within days. She always wanted more. It wasn't even the money, really. It was the image. She wanted the appearance of success, the Instagram-worthy dinners, the expensive vacations, the attention. I remember once we went to a wedding in Newport. It was one of those fancy coastal events where everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. Rachel fit right in. I felt proud walking beside her, but also small. She laughed easily with people I didn't know, people who made twice what I did. That night, while driving home, she said, "Did you see how happy they looked? That's the kind of life I want someday." She didn't realize how much that sentence hollowed me out. I worked like a machine after that. Sometimes 16-hour days. I started investing, learning stocks, crypto, anything to multiply what I had. My diet went downhill, my sleep was a joke, and my friends started to fade away. But I was determined. If she wanted a rich lifestyle, I'd give her one. Except, she didn't wait. In early 2019, I found out Rachel had been spending time with a friend from her yoga studio. A guy named Evan. Older, wealthier, drove a Tesla, ran a startup. I noticed the signs, the extra time getting ready, the vague texts, the new perfume. But I ignored them until I couldn't anymore. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. Just one evening, her phone lit up with a message that read, "Same place tomorrow?" I confronted her, and though she denied it at first, the truth slipped out in fragments. "He just understands me better," she said. "He has ambition, drive." I remember standing there in that expensive apartment I'd upgraded for her, realizing she didn't see me at all anymore. She saw a man trying to catch up to her expectations. She moved out within a week. No big scene. No closure. Just a few boxes, a few tears, and an echoing emptiness where her presence used to be. 4 months afterward, I couldn't think straight. Everything I'd worked for, every late night, every sacrifice, felt meaningless. I'd built a life for someone who was never going to stay. But here's the thing. Pain has a strange way of reshaping you. By the end of 2019, I started to look at my life differently. I had money. I had experience. I had no one left to impress. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a question that changed everything. What if I worked this hard, but for me? That thought, small and quiet at first, became the beginning of something entirely new. The weeks after Rachel left felt like walking through fog, thick, slow, disorienting. Every corner of the apartment reminded me of her. The scent of her perfume clung to the closet. Her half of the bathroom sink still had stray bobby pins scattered like forgotten landmines. Even the silence had her shape in it. I kept going to work, because stopping meant thinking. I buried myself in projects, coding until my eyes burned, replying to emails long past midnight. My coworkers called me the machine. They thought I was ambitious. They didn't see the truth, that I was running from the echo of her voice saying, "He just understands me better." Nights were the worst. I'd scroll through social media and torture myself. Photos of her with him. Trips. Dinners. Smiles that looked so real I almost believed them. She looked happy. Effortlessly happy. And I hated that I still cared. By November 2019, I'd lost 10 pounds, developed an addiction to black coffee, and started missing deadlines for the first time in my career. My boss called me into his office one afternoon, a quiet man named David who'd been through 2 divorces. He didn't say much, just told me I was burning out and should take some time off. I nodded, pretending I was fine. But inside, I knew he was right. So, I took a week. I drove up to Maine, Bar Harbor, to be specific. I'd been there once as a kid with my parents, back when life was simple and love was something you didn't question. I rented a cabin near the water, turned off my phone, and tried to remember who I was before her. The first few days were miserable. My mind kept looping through old memories, our first Christmas together, that trip to Vermont, the night she said she believed in me. But slowly, as the days passed, the constant noise inside me began to quiet down. On the 4th day, I hiked alone through Acadia National Park. It was late fall, the air sharp and cold, the trees mostly bare except for stubborn amber leaves clinging to branches. Somewhere along that trail, I sat on a rock overlooking the ocean, and it hit me how small I was. Not in a depressing way, more like in a freeing way. I'd spent years trying to build something grand enough to keep her. And for what? She was gone. And yet, the world kept turning. The tide kept moving. The sun still rose. When I got back home, I deleted all our pictures. Every last one. I threw out the things that reminded me of her, the dress she left behind, the mug we bought in Miami, the framed photo on my desk. For the first time in years, the apartment looked bare, but it also looked mine. That's when something inside me shifted. I stopped trying to prove myself to ghosts. I started pouring all that energy into building something that actually mattered to me. I began learning everything I could about investing, entrepreneurship, personal finance. I devoured books, Rich Dad Poor Dad, Atomic Habits, The Millionaire Fast Lane. I started following people like Naval Ravikant and Gary Vee, not because I wanted to be them, but because I wanted to understand the mindset that didn't depend on validation. Then 2020 arrived. The world changed. COVID hit, and suddenly everyone was locked inside. My company switched to remote work. Most people hated it, but I thrived. The isolation didn't scare me. I'd already been living in my own emotional quarantine for months. During that time, I discovered something unexpected. Freedom. Real freedom. No one to impress. No deadlines outside my own. I saved money like crazy. No restaurants, no bars, no unnecessary shopping. Every dollar went into savings or stocks. When the market crashed that March, I took a gamble. I invested everything I had. People said I was crazy, but something in me said it was the right move. By late 2020, those investments started to grow. Slowly at first, then rapidly. I started trading, learning patterns, reading charts like they were stories. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to watch pre-market activity, analyzing trends like it was art. For the first time since Rachel left, I felt alive. But there was something else brewing in me too, a kind of silent revenge. Not the petty kind where you wish someone bad luck. No, this was different. I wanted to build such a life that, if she ever saw me again, she'd realize she'd walked away from the best thing that could have happened to her. So I worked. Harder than ever. By 2021, I'd built a solid stock portfolio, a decent crypto account, and a small online consulting business helping small firms automate systems. It started as a side hustle, but within 6 months, it began bringing in more money than my main job. That's when I quit. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. I remember handing in my resignation letter, half expecting regret to hit me. It never did. I was free, truly free. I rented a new apartment in Cambridge. Sleek, modern, with a city view. I bought a better car, not because I wanted to show off, but because I could. I started dressing differently, eating better, even exercising again. The mirror no longer reflected the tired, broken man from 2019. But the real turning point came in August 2021. I got invited to a networking dinner for entrepreneurs. It was at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Charles River. I remember standing there, drink in hand, feeling like an imposter among people who owned companies worth millions. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a familiar laugh. Rachel. She was there. Same confident posture, same effortless smile, but something was off. Maybe it was me, or maybe it was her. Her eyes had a tiredness I hadn't seen before. The guy she was with wasn't Evan. Some other man, older, with a kind of expensive arrogance that screamed temporary. She saw me too. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something else. Hesitation, maybe. I nodded politely. She smiled, but it was strained. Later that evening, when we crossed paths again, she congratulated me. Said she'd heard about my business through mutual friends. I could tell she was trying to sound casual, but her voice had a tremor. She asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no, just focusing on life. She nodded and said, "You look different. Happier." That line stayed with me. Because she was right. I was happier. Not because I'd become rich, not because I could finally afford the kind of life she wanted, but because I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel complete. That night, after the event, I walked along the river alone. The city lights shimmered on the water, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. But I wasn't done yet. That meeting with Rachel, it lit a new kind of fire in me. Not of bitterness this time, but of purpose. I didn't just want to build wealth. I wanted to build a life that felt earned. And that's when the real transformation began, the one that would redefine everything I thought I knew about success, love, and self-worth. After that night with Rachel at the rooftop event, something inside me shifted again. Not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt, but quietly, like a tide turning. I realized I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. 4 years, I had been driven by a mix of pain and ambition, using heartbreak as my rocket fuel. But that encounter, seeing her eyes flicker with recognition, maybe regret, was like watching the credits roll on a movie I didn't even like anymore. It was over. And in that ending, I found something I hadn't expected: emptiness. The kind that creeps in when you realize you've finally gotten everything you once thought you wanted, but it doesn't feel the way you imagined. I had money now. A business that was growing faster than I could manage. A small team of freelancers working under me. A penthouse condo overlooking the Boston skyline. On paper, it was everything. But nights were still quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. My phone barely rang. My parents were proud, but distant in the way parents often are when they think you're too busy for them. Friends had moved on with marriages and kids. And me? I just kept working because work was safe. But you can't outrun silence forever. By 2022, my business had expanded. Automation systems for medium-sized companies, mostly in the healthcare and finance sectors. The money was good, really good. I started traveling for conferences. New York, Chicago, sometimes London. I stayed in hotels that had robes so soft you'd think they were spun out of clouds. I ate at Michelin star restaurants, shook hands with people who used phrases like synergistic growth. And yet, every time I went back to my hotel room, I'd stare out the window and feel that same old ache. Not for Rachel, I'd long stopped caring about her, but for meaning. I'd worked so hard to build this empire of independence that I hadn't realized how lonely the top floor could be. There was one trip that really stuck with me. February 2022, London. It was freezing, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones. I was staying near Tower Bridge, overlooking the Thames. One night, I went out walking, trying to clear my head after a long day of meetings. I passed couples holding hands, laughing, ducking into pubs glowing with warm yellow light. The sound of music and chatter spilled into the streets. I stood there for a while, watching strangers live lives that looked simple but full. And it hit me, I'd built wealth, but not warmth. The realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't send me spiraling. It just settled in, like a quiet truth I could no longer ignore. That night, I promised myself something. I was done chasing external validation. I didn't need to prove anything, not to Rachel, not to anyone. I wanted to start living for me, but not the success-obsessed version of me. The real me, the guy who loved old movies, spontaneous road trips, quiet Sunday mornings, and the smell of rain on pavement. When I got back to the States, I made changes. First, I downsized. Sold the penthouse, bought a cozy home just outside the city, not because I had to, but because I wanted a place that felt lived in, not like a showroom. I rehired some of my old friends to help with the business, not as employees but as partners. We turned the company into something more human. We started mentoring younger developers who wanted to start freelancing. And for the first time, I felt proud, not for the money, but for the impact. Still, despite the progress, there was one loose thread I hadn't tied up. Rachel. I hadn't spoken to her since that night by the river. But life has a funny way of reintroducing old ghosts. In late 2022, I got a message on LinkedIn. It was her. The kind of short, polite message people send when they're testing the waters. She congratulated me on an article I'd written about business resilience. Said she was inspired by my journey. I stared at that message for a long time before replying. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part, the curious, human part, wanted closure. So, I responded. Briefly. Politely. That turned into a few exchanged messages, which turned into her suggesting coffee, just to catch up. We met on a chilly December afternoon at a cafe near Copley Square. She looked different. Older, a little more fragile around the eyes, but still put together. I expected awkwardness, but the conversation flowed surprisingly easily. She told me about her life, how Evan's company had gone under, how they broke up soon after, how she'd moved back to Boston and was working in real estate. She talked a lot. I mostly listened. At one point, she said, "You really did it, huh? Built the life you always talked about." And I said, "No. I built the life you always talked about." Then realized it wasn't mine. The words came out softer than I meant them to, but they hung in the air like smoke. She looked down, stirred her coffee, and whispered, "I didn't know what I wanted back then." I believed her. But I also knew it didn't matter anymore. We were two completely different people now, separated not by distance, but by growth. She was still chasing something shiny. I was finally content standing still. We parted on good terms. No tears, no resentment. Just two people acknowledging the strange paths life had taken them on. That night, I went home and sat in my living room, looking around at the quiet space I'd built. I realized something profound. Sometimes, the most powerful kind of revenge is peace. Not anger, not proving someone wrong, but reaching a point where their opinion no longer holds any weight at all. Still, closure doesn't mean you're immune to reflection. There were nights I'd think back to who I used to be, the insecure 20-something desperate to be enough. I felt a quiet sadness for that version of me, but also pride. Because he had to exist for this version of me to be born. As 2023 began, I started doing something I'd never done before, speaking publicly about my story. Podcasts, small business seminars, even guest lectures at my old university. Not about heartbreak or revenge, but about self-worth, resilience, and how ambition without self-awareness can destroy you. People connected with it. I remember one student, after a talk, coming up to me and saying, "So basically, your ex breaking your heart made you rich?" I laughed. "No," I said. "It made me awake." And that became the core of everything I taught. That pain isn't a full stop. It's a comma. A pause that forces you to rewrite your next sentence. But the funny thing about peace is that once you have it, life tests it. In early 2023, an investor approached me about scaling my business into something bigger, a full-fledged tech consultancy with international clients. The opportunity was massive, but it also came with risks. It meant stepping back into that high-pressure world I'd finally escaped. For weeks, I couldn't decide. The younger me would have jumped without hesitation. But the older me, the one who'd learned that success without balance was just another cage, hesitated. And that hesitation became the seed of the next big change in my life. Because sometimes, moving forward doesn't mean climbing higher. Sometimes, it means turning in a completely new direction. By mid-2023, I realized that life wasn't about simply surviving or proving people wrong. It was about choosing your battles, and more importantly, choosing the person you wanted to become. After years of working endlessly, chasing wealth, and trying to impress a woman who was never impressed, I finally understood that the real victory wasn't money, or recognition, or even Rachel noticing me. It was freedom. Freedom to decide what mattered and freedom to pursue it without guilt. The first big step was scaling my business. The investor's proposal was tempting. They wanted me to take the consultancy international, hire dozens of people, and handle major corporate clients across Europe and North America. On paper, it was perfect. But in reality, it felt like diving back into the storm I had spent years escaping. Long hours, constant travel, stress that seeped into every corner of your life, the same trap I had fallen into before. So I made a choice that surprised everyone, including myself. I declined the big investment. Instead, I chose to grow organically. Small, deliberate steps. Clients who aligned with my values, projects that excited me rather than drained me, and a team that felt more like family than employees. I realized that slow, steady growth meant sustainability. And for the first time, I wasn't doing it for approval or status. I was doing it because I wanted to. Around the same time, I started focusing on self-investment. Not just money, but my mind, body, and relationships. I returned to hobbies I'd abandoned years ago, reading novels, experimenting in the kitchen, hiking on weekends, even learning photography. I signed up for a pottery class, something absurdly messy, but it brought a kind of joy I hadn't felt since college. Life was no longer a checklist of accomplishments. It was a series of moments, small but deeply meaningful. And then came the moment that truly turned the tables. It was September 2023. I had been invited to speak at a tech conference in New York. A luxurious event, the kind of place I'd once dreamed of being invited to, but this time, I felt calm. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, certainly not Rachel. I was simply there to share what I had learned about building sustainable businesses and resilient lives. Halfway through the day, during a coffee break, I ran into a group of attendees I knew from a networking event in 2021. And there, at the edge of the crowd, was her. Rachel. She looked different this time, more polished, but tired. That same hunger for luxury in her eyes was there, but it had a sharper edge, almost desperate. She smiled when she saw me. A little too bright, a little too forced. I realized, then, that nothing about me had to prove anything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking validation. And yet, a subtle, quiet satisfaction crept through me as I observed her. Life hadn't stopped for her either, but I could see the cracks. Projects that hadn't gone well, relationships that hadn't lasted, the kind of restless ambition that never truly settles. We exchanged polite hellos. She asked what I had been up to. I gave her a concise summary of my consultancy, the books I'd been writing, the speaking engagements. She listened, nodding, but I could tell she was doing that thing people do when they're processing that someone has outgrown them. It was in that moment I realized, I didn't need to climb over her to succeed. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone from my past. The real triumph was in having built a life that she couldn't touch, not because it was wealthy, but because it was independent. Whole. Untouchable. That evening, back in my hotel room, I reflected on everything that had led me here. The heartbreak, the long nights of coding, the lonely weekends, the relentless drive to be enough. I understood, finally, that all of it had been shaping me into someone who could withstand anything life threw at him. And in doing so, I realized something else. I had never actually been building a life for Rachel. I had been building a life for me. I just hadn't known it at the time. The next few months were transformative. I expanded my consultancy just enough to have a comfortable, thriving business. I traveled for work selectively, balancing adventure with stability. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, teaching them to avoid the same pitfalls I had. And slowly, I began to focus on emotional wealth as much as financial wealth, meaningful relationships, self-care, and time for the simple joys of life. And then, one unexpected opportunity came knocking, a chance to invest in a real estate project that could potentially double my net worth. Unlike before, I didn't feel the pressure to say yes immediately. I evaluated the risks, thought through the consequences, and negotiated terms that protected me. By this point, the power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer scrambling for approval, chasing dreams that weren't mine, or proving my worth to anyone else. I was the one holding the reins. By the end of 2023, I was financially stable, emotionally grounded, and intellectually stimulated in a way I had never been before. Rachel's presence in my life, fleeting as it was, had transformed from a source of pain to a catalyst for growth. She had wanted a rich lifestyle, but she had underestimated the one thing she could never buy, self-mastery. And I had it. One evening, sitting on my balcony overlooking the Charles River, a glass of bourbon in hand, I allowed myself a rare indulgence, reflection without regret. I thought about the man I had been, chasing a dream that wasn't mine, and the man I had become, standing firm in his own life. I realized that success is not about wealth alone. It is about the power to define your own happiness, to rise after betrayal, to make choices that serve your growth rather than someone else's expectations. And for the first time in years, I felt untouchable, not because anyone feared me, but because no one could ever sway me from my own course. That is when I understood the ultimate truth. The life Rachel wanted was never mine to give her. But the life I wanted, I had claimed it for myself. And it was more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined, richer than any relationship built on admiration or validation. By early 2024, my life had taken on a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike. Not the kind of dream where everything is surreal and unachievable, but the kind that hums quietly beneath your skin, a sense of flow, balance, and purpose. My consultancy had stabilized, my investments were yielding steady returns, and my days were filled with challenges that excited rather than exhausted me. The hardest lesson I had learned, though, wasn't about finance or career. It was about self-worth. About understanding that no one has the right to define your value. Not a partner, not a family member, not society. That truth had taken years of heartbreak, countless sleepless nights, and a relentless drive fueled partly by anger, partly by hope. But finally, I could sit with it and feel the calm power of owning it. One afternoon in March, I found myself at a local coffee shop near my home in Cambridge. I had been mentoring a young entrepreneur, a bright kid named Leo who reminded me painfully of the man I used to be, eager, ambitious, yet tethered by doubt. We spent hours discussing strategy, growth, and the pitfalls of chasing validation. When he left, he thanked me with a heartfelt smile, and I realized how far I'd come, not just materially, but emotionally. I was giving back what I wished someone had given me years ago: clarity, perspective, and a blueprint for resilience. That evening, I went for a walk along the Charles River, the sky streaked with pink and orange as the sun dipped low. The air smelled faintly of spring, a mixture of fresh blooms and the lingering scent of the river. I thought about Rachel. I thought about the life she wanted and the life I had built. And I laughed quietly to myself, a low, genuine chuckle that carried a weight of release. She had wanted the lifestyle that money could buy. I had wanted something far more precious: autonomy, growth, and peace. And in claiming that for myself, I realized the ultimate irony. I had given myself everything she had ever demanded of me, but she never deserved it. Over the next few months, I allowed myself to explore life in ways I never could before. I traveled, yes, but differently. Not for Instagram photos or to prove status, but to experience. Italy in late spring, walking through Florence before the crowds arrived, tasting wine at a small vineyard that no one knew existed. Japan in autumn, marveling at the fiery maple trees, the quiet temples, and the way a nation so different from mine could feel strangely familiar in its attention to detail and respect for patience. I had finally learned the art of living slowly, deliberately, intentionally. And then came the unexpected: love. Not the obsessive, consuming kind that had blinded me before, but a gentle, grounding presence. Her name was Elena. We met at a lecture I was giving about entrepreneurship and resilience. She was curious, intelligent, and unafraid to speak her mind. Our connection wasn't instant fireworks. It was something quieter, a warmth that settled in your chest and didn't demand anything from you except presence. For the first time in years, I was free to love someone without losing myself, without the frantic need to prove my worth. Looking back now, it's almost surreal to think about that period of my life when Rachel left, and I felt like everything had crumbled. It hadn't crumbled, it had been a necessary tearing down. Pain had stripped me of illusions, heartbreak had exposed truths, and betrayal had ignited a fire that no one could ever put out again. I remember sitting on my balcony one evening in September 2024, Elena beside me, watching the city lights shimmer on the water. I thought about how far I had come, from a man desperate to prove himself worthy of someone else's dreams to a man finally living his own. The bourbon glass I held reflected the cityscape, fractured like the pieces of my past, yet whole in a way that felt stronger than anything I'd known before. Sometimes I still think about Rachel. Not with anger, not with regret, but with gratitude. She had forced me to see my own worth, to realize that no one else's desires could define my life. And in that understanding, I had found something richer than money, more fulfilling than admiration, and infinitely more enduring than fleeting love. In the end, I didn't just survive betrayal, I transformed it. I didn't just reclaim my life, I redefined it. And as I watched the sun set over the river, Elena laughing at something I said, I know this truth fully. I built my life for me, and in doing so, I discovered the one thing no one could ever take away: my freedom, my purpose, and the quiet, unshakable joy of knowing I am enough, wholly and completely, just as I am.